Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs War Room Update. We are over 260 days into the war with the terrorists in Gaza. It's not only Hamas, it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it's the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, it's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It's a whole spectrum of terrorists that are operating in the Gaza Strip. They're all acting together, all acting for that common cause of the destruction of Israel. It started obviously back then on the 7th of October with the murder of 1,200 people and the taking of over 250 hostages into the Gaza Strip. We still have now 120 hostages being held in the Gaza Strip. 8 of them have American citizenship. 5 of them have UK citizenship. There are dozens of countries represented within those hostages. No one really is doing so much about that. Israel is trying to fight on the ground to destroy the Hamas capabilities on the one hand, both its governance and its military capabilities, and at the same time to bring about the release, the freeing of the hostages. Those are two goals that don't always go together, with the Hamas, with the terrorists, suggesting that Israel give up, accept a ceasefire in order to bring about the release of some of the hostages, but really not really giving back all of the hostages, not guaranteeing that all of the live hostages will even be released on the first stages as a condition for then moving forward. But for that, they want, obviously, for the war to end. And that war isn't ending. At the moment, the IDF forces are operating still in the central Gaza Strip, in Gaza City, around Gaza City, unfortunately also taking casualties there. And we're also operating in Rafah, that southern city of the Gaza Strip that borders on with Egypt. We've now taken control of that famous Philadelphia corridor that we've discussed many times, that area adjacent to and parallel to the border with Egypt. Egypt's obviously quite vexed by that because we're now discovering the length and the breadth and really the scope of the tunnels that Egypt had allowed Hamas to dig underneath the border as a means to supply itself with weapons that were flowing freely through the Sinai into the Gaza Strip. Not only weapons, cars, all types of goods and commodities that were coming in through those tunnels. Now, as the IDF has been operating, as we've seized the Rafah crossing, Egypt suddenly isn't willing to play ball anymore. They're not willing to allow any of the aid to go from the international community to go through the Sinai, through Rafah and on to its really, its target is the civilian population in Gaza. But as we saw recently, reports saying that over 80% of the aid that has gone into Gaza has been commandeered, taken over by the terrorists as a means to A, sustain themselves in their fight against Israel, and B, also to sell that food on, the food that they got for free, that they're selling on to the Gazans as a means to really to recuperate their financial losses and to ensure that they make, the claims have been made that there's been $500 million of profit for Hamas during this war just on selling on aid to the starving, as it were, according to the ICC prosecutor, the starving Gazan population, when at the same time we're seeing videos coming out of Gaza of an abundance of food, Israeli fruits being sold on the streets of Gaza. There isn't even a spike tremendously, according to the Gazans, in the price of the food. It's relatively normal prices, and yet the ICC prosecutor still claims that Israel is using starvation as a means of warfare against the Gazan population. Really, I think he should get a better idea of what starvation is and what starvation as a means of warfare really means in our context. Moving up to the north, what we've seen in the last few days is really an escalation by Hezbollah on all fronts. Hezbollah is worried. Hezbollah has heard over and over again that Israel has almost finalized, if not already finalized, its preparations for responding to the 8-month, almost 9-month war of attrition that's been going on. Hezbollah, Lebanon, the country of Lebanon, attacking Israel. It's not only Hezbollah. We can't only say that it's that one rogue terrorist group. Hezbollah is Lebanon. Lebanon is Hezbollah. and Lebanon eventually will pay the price. We've seen really a number of reports coming out that even foreign diplomats are starting to leave Lebanon on their droves. We've seen intelligence reports coming out that Hezbollah, as we already knew, this has really been common knowledge for quite a while. Hezbollah has been storing its massive stockpiles of long-range weapons, smart bombs, and UAVs in the civilian airport of Beirut. That obviously turns that target into a proper military target. And if Hezbollah has been using the airport there for storing its weapons, then they know that there is a big attack on the way that will really focus on the airport in Beirut amongst all of the other targets. The Houthis in the south have continued on with their aggression in the Gulf of Eden and coming up to the Red Sea, attacking a number of targets, saying that it attacked a UK vessel, saying that they'd even attacked a US war vessel. We're not really sure what they're talking about on most of those occasions, but that threat does exist, and a number of vessels have been hit by the different weaponry employed by the Houthis. Now, obviously, the connecting thread between all of those is Iran pulling the strings really of its puppets, of its proxies all around in order to attack Israel from every single point possible, from the north, from the south, from the southwest, from the southeast, even from Judea and Samaria, the Iraqi militias moving into Syria, all part of that Iranian plan to strangle Israel. But what we're going to talk today with our special guest is really warfare on the ground. We've heard a lot of claims in the last 9 months about what Israel is doing and isn't doing, and whether it's breaching the laws of war, and how it's fighting in urban territories using big bombs, which are obviously prohibited, so they claim, by international law. And so today we're joined by Major John Spencer, who's the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Major Spencer, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's amazing to be able to maybe have a discussion, if we could, on your impressions of what's actually going on the ground. You've been to Gaza a number of times during this conflict. What would you say is the reflection of what's going on the ground?
I would say, as I've visited to include into Khan Yunis with the 98th Division, what's going on the ground is a very restrained use of force to achieve the goals set by Israel in Gaza, within the political context of what Israel has to the world that Israel lives in, where they're held to a double standard, if not a triple standard. Actually, based on my research of over a decade of urban warfare, Israel's held to a standard that doesn't exist, a standard that no military has ever followed. And I knew that as I observed from October 8th on, Israel preparing for the operation, in Israel launching the operation to achieve its goals, to bring the hostages home, to remove Hamas from power, to dismantle their military, and to secure the southern border, that Israel used very strong restraints, from evacuating cities to the use of munitions, despite all of the international condemnation. And I hope we get to talk about that. But basically everything that's been said about the IDF has actually been the opposite of what I've observed in reality, to include frontline forces, their demeanor, the restraints on the use of force that all militaries impose, the use of tactics that no military has ever tried to prevent civilian harm, and doing the job despite the constraints of the world, where statements from political leaders say things like the correct number of civilian casualties is 0. Well, that would mean don't fight the war, because there's never been a battle. But this is also the first war I've ever observed in my long history both as a serviceman in the U.S. Army and as a student, where not only did people believe there could be a daily civilian casualty count, but they took the word of a terrorist organization on what it would be, and just started parroting a terrorist organization's numbers, which is the exact strategy that they want to get the world, the United Nations, the United States to force Israel to be defeated. And because really that's what I think, all the way up to your comments in the beginning about what Hamas wants. Hamas wants Israel to be forced to accept a Hamas victory. That's pretty much straightforward. If anybody thought that Hamas was going to give up the hostages or conduct a unilateral surrender and disarmament, I mean, it's just foolish based on just Hamas's history, let alone war.
It's amazing when you say that Israel is held to a double standard, John. It's something that myself, my background is in law, as you might know, having advised also the Israeli forces on really the laws of war, and suddenly you realize that the standard that's being applied to Israel has no connection to the laws of war whatsoever. It doesn't matter how many precautions we take. It doesn't matter how many warnings we issue. It doesn't matter how cautious we are using smart bombs instead of other munitions. It seems that we're being vilified for everything. To what extent, John, do you believe that that will have an impact on really future wars, but really of Western countries against terrorism? Is this not going to set a new standard, which even though no other country has ever been required to meet that standard, this will now become the standard? Or do you believe that nonetheless it will remain a double standard simply for Israel?
That's a great question. And actually, as you know, and as I've had to learn, I mean, the laws of war are very, I think, strong and very clear on proportionality, necessity, precautions, everything. It's very clear. I've also been asked, do I think we need new or additions to the law of war? No, I think we have a crisis of people just understanding what they are. But then also, which I think people don't understand, when an expert comes up and says Israel is doing something different than somebody else has done, and they compare apples to oranges, I am 100%. I've been trying to write about it. One, you have to assume this is more than just about a nation in war, because as I've picked apart every allegation waged, from the use of starvation as a form of war, indiscriminate bombing, all these libels, or genocide. I mean, it's crazy that you have to see that it's more than just a misunderstanding of the law of war. It is, because it's Israel. I am very concerned, though, that the standards that the world, whether it's the United Nations or others, are trying to imply are the standards, would then become a standard for not just against terrorists, in war in general. And I think the use of bombs in urban areas is one of the examples, right? Where Israel was just condemned for the use of, let's say, a 2,000-pound bomb in an urban area, despite it being a very heavily used munition in past wars, like the United States using over 15,000 in the first Gulf War, over 5,000 when I did the invasion of Iraq in less than a month, because it's a very standard military munition to hit an enemy in a bunker underground, which we know Hamas built its whole strategy to use its tunnels and to continue to go at a deeper depth, so you couldn't get to them. And then they put people on top of them, civilians that they want to sacrifice. But there's been this growing interest in the human rights community to ban the use of all bombs, missiles, mortars, artillery in urban areas, period. Like I've known about that for a long time. So I knew where the accusation came from, but then the way that the world took it on, how dare you use a munition of that size in an urban area, even if you've evacuated all the civilians, like you're predicting, which is what I'm very concerned about. If you think that that's the future, that in any war, a Western military who's following all the laws of war, despite the other side not, to include a state actor like Russia or Iran, anybody else, which the law accounts for. Like we still, because of our moral values of our nation, follow the laws of war in the application of force in war. But if this standard, like these, well, you can't do that, you can't go into a city unless you've evacuated it, all of these would actually have huge implications to the point where nations can't wage war. I agree that war, the laws of war, as you know, were put in to put limits on the brutality of war, especially the Geneva Conventions after World War II. Like, we're never going to indiscriminately bomb civilians to try to force their leadership to give up the will to fight. But when Israel is following every rule that's ever been thought of and implementing ones that nobody's tried, and then gets told that, well, you got to find a different way, which is also what we're seeing and what I've said. Like, if you ban the use of bombs in urban combat, then you're going to see a lot more urban combat around the world because, of course, a weaker force will say, look, all I have to do is get into the urban area and you can't touch me unless you come in here. And I turn it into a meat grinder where you lose tens of thousands of soldiers and I achieve my political goals. You're 100% right. This double, triple standard that Israel is being held to will come back to bite the world in the future.
And that's part of the discussion that's been going on about the use of munitions, this almost unique requirement that Israel only use smart munitions, that it only use smart bombs that can go through the windows of every single apartment block and only surgically take out the terrorists. That's never been a standard in warfare whatsoever. Just the basic idea that, well, there are 2,000-pound bombs to acquire. They've been produced. They've been mass produced. That means someone must be using them, and we're not buying them from Russia. We're not buying them from Iran. We're not buying them from terrorist organizations that are serial abusers of the laws of war. We're buying them from or getting them from the United States, from countries that do have a long-standing tradition of respecting the laws of war. So how do you think that our whole discussion, really, it seems that we're getting confused between humanitarian law, the laws of war, and human rights law? Well, let's all put flowers into our guns and all be friends. They don't seem to go together, and yet that's the standard that appears to be applied to Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know this better, right? Why do most U.S. military law manuals don't call it international humanitarian law? They call it the law of armed conflict, because international humanitarian law allows this conversation, and the human rights activist groups, like Human Rights Watch and everything, they do great work. But their actual agenda is to prevent all war, right? And if you ban war, again, there's a long history of trying to put the limits on war, which has actually led to more destruction. This is where I've argued in the United Nations and other places, there is this large initiative to, at first it was banned and now it's restrict the use of explosive wide area formed weapons in populated areas, where it's literally bombing everything from not just smart munitions, but every artillery round, right? We used 35,000 artillery rounds in a 5-month battle in Raqqa. I mean, urban combat is hell, but people don't realize that people are driving it into urban areas with this ideal that, hey, you military guys, you fight your wars if you want, just do it, just go out and stand in the open and attack each other. That's never happened in war. It's not going to happen. I agree with you. It's very concerning. And some people believe, well, when that time comes, it'll be different. But this has been like, okay, for Israel, like everybody acknowledged they were attacked, and you did a great summary of the invasion of Israel that happened, the act of war of Hamas, Israel, accordance with the UN Charter, Article 51, responding in self-defense. But then somebody thought that there was a different way, right? You don't need to go into the urban areas to bring the hostages home, to remove Hamas from power. Like, it's anti-intellectual. It is, I understand the human rights groups, and it isn't law, right? It's not even human rights law, but the human rights group, like, hey, look, do those things, but there can be zero civilian suffering. Even when the actual combatant, it's the first in history that I've ever seen, not the Nazis, not the Japanese, not even ISIS, did things to get their entire population killed and says that's what they want to achieve their political goals. I've never seen that. But the idea of this standard will be applied to anybody else. One is that if you're saying like, oh, no, this is just a standard for Israel, like that's a major problem. if it is a standard, do you think that other militaries will follow in the future, to include the ones who follow all the laws of war? We're not even going to talk about Russia, Syria, all the others who don't follow a single law of war. But if you're going to say that, yes, you Western militaries who follow these laws we all agreed to, but here are some additional things to include, don't fight in urban areas that you need to follow, it's going to be very problematic for the future of all nations.
And really, especially when you're talking about non-state actors, when you're talking about terrorist groups who intentionally, as you said, and Hamas are really experts at this, at embedding themselves in the civilian population, in schools, in mosques, in hospitals, underneath the schools, tunnel systems spreading around the entire Gaza Strip. I'm English, as people know. They've built a tunnel system which is larger than the London Underground. Just in Gaza, which they refuse to allow the Gazans to actually take refuge in, though they're only, as they've said clearly, even in the press, the tunnels are only for the Hamas fighters. They're only there for the war against Israel, for holding the hostages, and so you have this intentional embedding of the terrorists in the civilian population. They're trying to get everyone killed because that makes Israel look bad, and yet Israel seems to be trying to do everything it can. The precautions that Israel has taken seem to warn the population, to move the civilian population out of the way, seem to be, at least from my experience, something that hasn't really been seen before. This ability to move a million people out of the way from the northern Gaza Strip. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of leaflets, of phone calls, of SMSs, of messaging, of loudspeakers, everything that's been done. Is that, in your experience, something that had been adopted before in other urban circumstances of warfare?
So that's a great question. And which really gets to when I say that Israel's being held to a standard that nobody's following, because the experts who are criticizing Israel's operations in this war are using a standard called the Civilian Harm Mitigation Guidelines, which was created over the last 20 years through best practices of commanders on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq during counterinsurgency and counterterrorist operations. And even then, they didn't, it's a collection of those practices that has actually never been implemented in totality. Right? It's a best practice, like if you can do these things. 100%. Matter of fact, even evacuating cities isn't what you do in an invasion of another territory, right? That's not what we did invading Panama, invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan. The whole purpose of war is to end it quickly, so it does limit the suffering on the populations that are caught in between. You do it with overwhelming force, surprise, and speed. But this hangover from the war on terrorism, the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency period, has made people think that these tactics of, you have all the time in the world. Of course, you can take months to empty a city and all its people. Even if they refuse to leave, you can get them out, and only the enemy will be left. And oh, by the way, don't do it with a lot of munitions if they're in tunnels, because on top of those 400 miles of tunnels of Hamas, they also did it at a depth that makes it harder to reach them, even if you have a bunker busting munition, right? Because they've learned from the Israel's wars 2008, 14, 21 that they need to go deeper, making it a more of a challenge to get to them, because their goal is not to fight the idea. Their goal is just to wait them out until the international community stops Israel and tells them they can't go another step, which has happened in the past. But no, all those things you listed, some of those things, the main standard practice in a counterinsurgency situation. And again, Hamas is not an insurgency. Hamas has governed Gaza for 15 years. It's not a state. You call it a statelet. They had all administrative control, built a massive military, squandered billions of dollars instead of improving the lives of the Palestinian people in Gaza to build this terror military complex. So that the idea of even applying these standards of, first, okay, don't go in with amazing speed to overwhelm the enemy and make them believe that they shouldn't resist because they've lost the will to fight, which is the goal of war. But first, wait. Israel did that. It waited over 3 weeks before launching after October 7th to allow civilians to leave. And the world said, well, you can't do that. You can't evacuate 1 million people out of northern Gaza and into southern Gaza, into the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. Like literally, they said you couldn't, and Israel did, and effectively did, of over 850,000, which is like 85%, even in a counterinsurgency war, would be a very high standard of success of evacuating the civilians, then launched their ground invasion. And then, even when the world said, well, that's not good enough, started handing out their maps. No military in the world's ever done that. Handed out their maps. The IDF handed out their maps to the civilian and to Hamas and telegraphed every move they were making. They used advanced technologies, flying drones with speakers, using cell phone presence to know where the civilian presence was, and then not going into those areas until they've been evacuated. People don't understand they're in a ceasefire. Hamas shifted all the civilians back into areas and increased the population of like Khan Yunis by 300%. Israel has done more of these things that were used in counterinsurgency wars, not in wars, which is, again, when people give you the comparison, like the whole condemnation and why I've been so vocal of like every comparison since October, the fact that is most destructive of any war in the last 20 years. Like, okay, who's had a war in the last 20 years? Counterinsurgency operations are different. One of the differences is time. So everybody gave Israel advice on the way to do it, on the way to bring the hostages home. Don't launch a ground invasion. Just use raids. Well, I know it'll take you a few years to get your hostages home, but just use raids and strategic strikes to take out Hamas leadership. Like, that's anti-historical. Like, it's never happened. No military's ever been successful in doing something like that. So why would you think that would be working?
No military's ever been required to do that.
Correct. I mean, it's crazy, right? So it's crazy that it's unfortunate, one, that this is this double standard. It's not even a double standard. It's like a standard that doesn't exist, that's never been in place. To include, don't use any munition that will reach somebody in a bunker. Go send your soldiers in to be sacrificed, and don't strike the enemy before you get there with a military munition. Even if the city is empty of people, they literally are saying don't use those munitions in a city, even if you've emptied the entire city of people, even if you've done everything you can to mitigate civilian harm. And they don't even know even the misuse of proportionality, which you saw, I'm sure, in October, November. Like, I don't think you know what that word means. You're not using it right, because it is in proportion to the military advantage. And okay, you're comparing it against other situations that weren't of this context. Like, it's an assessment of the military advantage versus collateral damage versus what you've done, all feasible steps and all steps that nobody's ever done to limit civilian harm. But this is the calculation of zero civilian casualty. There's never been a war in the history of humans where there's been a war where there have been zero civilian casualties. Yes, we've created all kinds of things to limit civilian casualties. But Hamas, like you said, spent years developing a environment with the sole purpose to get civilians killed if Israel ever entered that environment. And like you said, even with all the libels of Israel not helping in humanitarian crisis, when the UN, like 1,000 trucks are sitting in Kerem Shalom right now, and the UN says, well, it's not safe enough for us to deliver it, and there are armed groups taking the aid, so we're just not going to do it. I mean, it's very problematic, not just for Israel, because, like, you're right. If this was another country, would somebody tell them, like, hey, look, what you're doing there, you can't keep doing that. You need to find a different way to achieve your goals, legitimate goals. We all recognize it's a just war. Those are legitimate goals, but you need to find a different way. Well, what's your recommendation? Well, just don't do it.
So I'll add in even another part of the equation, which I think people tend to ignore. If that wasn't the standard, even that it was applied in Afghanistan, in Iraq, which were, I don't know, 7,000 miles away from any US soil, here we're dealing with a situation where Gaza is immediately adjacent to Israel, where we still have, to this day, mortar attacks being carried out from within the tents in the humanitarian zones. The terrorists are still fighting and still firing weapons at us and still firing projectiles at us. And so we also have to add into not only the equation, not only the way that the war is conducted against these terrorists, but also the urgency of the action. It would be the equivalent of having thousands of US hostages being held in a bunker in Iraq, what would the American people, what would the US administration do in that kind of a situation? Would they say, well, you know what, we're not going to go in and fight with all that force. We're just going to go in and use surgical weapons to carry out surgical attacks. And who would even accept that type of an argument?
I guarantee the American people wouldn't accept that argument. And that's a good question, which has been asked, like, what would America have done in the same situation? Choose a border, had somebody not just invaded and taking hundreds of hostages and started bombarding, 4,000 rockets launched on October 7th, 9,000 more launched since then, and continuous rocket. General Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff for two presidents, said, what do you think that I would have recommended to the US president for us to do? We would have used overwhelming military force to achieve our objectives of bringing our people home and securing our borders and protecting our nation as quickly as possible. Step one would be ensuring not a single rocket emanated out of the enemy territory headed towards our civilian areas like Los Angeles, let's say if you're on the southern border. General Milley has been very vocal. Of course, we would have used overwhelming force, immediate force. We have multiple divisions within a few hours of readiness that would have launched immediately to achieve our goals. And it's anti-intellectual to believe that doing all this limited civilian harm. If you do it, which is what the case study will show as I'm a researcher, is that what you have only done is protracted the war and increased the suffering. All of these groups who want to limit the suffering of war have, in this case, increased the suffering, not because of Israel, but because of Hamas and the pressure, hey, find a different way to achieve your goals. But we all agree, yeah, fine, you want to find a different way. Well, that's not what the United States would have done. Of course not. Or any other large nation under imminent threat, under attack of that scale on their borders. But why is Israel okay? But what you've actually done is you own the suffering from any real humanitarian crisis, the civilian deaths. That the number, of course, is a lie. It is not accurate. There's not that many civilian casualties, but some of that is because of the way you forced Israel to execute this campaign, because Israel is dependent on other nations for its survival, because like I'm sure we'll talk, it's under attack at this moment by many enemies, not just Hamas, but it wants its civilians home quickly. But this way has caused hostages to stay in captivity longer. This way has caused civilians to die. This way has caused civilians suffering. So that's the problem with applying this to the future, is that you would increase the brutality of war.
And what we're seeing also with the numbers of people being killed, we don't even know what the truth is. There's 1 week in the war, and I kid you not with this example from a UN organization that said in one given week there were 468 people killed. Of them, 500 were women and 1,500 were children. It's truly incredible when you see these numbers being thrown around, written on UN websites that are then quoted around the world by world leaders in the International Court of Justice, and there's no real basis to them. And so, where have you ever seen other situations, John, where the source of the information on the civilian casualties is the terrorists themselves? When anyone was fighting ISIS, did anyone rely on the ISIS numbers to say, well, this is how many civilians you've killed? Or was there even a basic requirement for there to be some type of verification, some type of authentication?
There's never been a case like this where they're taking the word of a terrorist organization who admittedly will not tell you if any of the numbers they're providing are actual combatants, individuals partaking in the hostilities, like the recent historical hostage rescue operation Israel did, and the world immediately starts numbers of civilians killed. If you're a civilian holding a hostage, you're partaking in the hostilities, and you are not a part of the numbers of civilians. You're no longer. So the numbers that have been all announced by Hamas do not account for a single combatant or a person partaking in the hostilities. But I've never seen a war or a battle or anything where somebody asked during the war, hey, anybody, what's the civilian to combatant ratio? And that's going to be our justification to use force to to cause one of you to stop, like Israel. Like, look, what's your civilian to combatant ratio? It's never been done. It's especially in urban combat where there is this mixing of civilians and combatants, when a combatant's using human shields, in Hamas's case, using human sacrifice, literally saying they want as many of them to die as possible and acting to fulfill that. I've never seen anybody take a terrorist word of the number, the entire world, never question where the number comes from, as all the experts, and I'm sure you know, show like if you took the terrorist number, which is not right, you know it is developed by, yes, body that's coming into the hospital, this amazing electronic registrar of, but it's also any report of a missing person, to include a Google Doc of report your martyrs here, to a social media post that I don't know where this person is. That all goes on the list, but nobody will ask that question when they use waged libels against Israel that they're intentionally causing civilian harm, when every bit of evidence shows that they are doing the opposite of intentionally. They're trying to prevent civilian harm despite Hamas's actions. But in past wars, right, it was months, or if not years after an urban battle, that they developed what is the civilian death toll. Like the one battle that everybody used in the beginning to compare against Gaza, which wasn't, it was a counterinsurgent. ISIS was an insurgency in Iraq, holding territory that was allowed to hold it for 2 years and built defenses up. But in that 2016-17 battle of Mosul, it was a year later that they came up with a number which ranged from 10,000 to 40,000. Nobody in the moment was saying, hey, ISIS, how many civilians have died inside the city? Nobody. That's just crazy. And again, if somebody thinks that'll be the standard for the next war, when the war begins, like, okay, what's the civilian death toll right now? Like, it's impossible. There's nobody who could ever do that.
But that's the way that the laws of war and really the reception of wars, it really comes up over time. It's state practice, and then opinion jurors. This idea of, well, what should be the standard that's applied to the different wars, and so really what you're saying is that by holding Israel to the separate standard, there'll be one of two things: either every future war of Western nations against terrorists will be truly have to be fought with two hands and two legs tied behind your back, or you're going to be accused of committing war crimes because they're not going to meet the standard that Israel has set and was still vilified for. So really, what does that say about the next terror war? Because that's the nature of the beast. The terrorists do all they can to spread the wars around and to breach their laws of war, whilst the nations, the Western nations at least, trying to fight back, are trying to fight within the boundaries of the laws of war. So how will that develop? Will this be the new standard? Is it going to be something which anyone else will be developed? Is there any work, to the best of your knowledge, to update the law, the war manual of the United States Army? Say, well, this is the new gold standard. This, and even add in additional precautions, because this wasn't even enough.
So just so I'm clear, because there's a recording, I have never said that Israel has created a gold standard, because I've been quoted as saying that, but I haven't, because a gold standard would be this imaginary standard of zero civilian casualties in a war. Israel has created a new standard that I think is very problematic. If it became some required standard. I mean, it does, again, if you had the time to understand where did the genesis of all these accusations that they're not following a standard, it's through this civilian harm mitigation thing, that where the U.S. military, because of the allegations against it, was Congress basically said, look, you're going to follow these new civilian harm mitigation standards, which are written in a way to say, if you can, again, based on proportionality and necessity, all these things. Like, and some people allow that in the door. Like I said, I think there's this initiative, which I'm holistically against, to limit, restrict, and originally it was banned the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And it's a political declaration, as you know, that has the intention to become one day, maybe possibly customary law, to where, again, this leads to, in my opinion, more destruction, more violence, especially in terror groups or any non-state actor that's trying to achieve a political goal. Like, not just the use of lawfare, which they use all these laws of war, like hospitals are protected, which for Israel has become hospitals are untouchable, which is literally a vignette of the problematic misapplication of what the law actually says. So if you let a new customary law or whatever come in the door saying where you can, restrict the use of these type of tools in urban combat, and then the world, because war is a contest of will. So what Hamas has done basically in convincing the world that these things are illegal, and mass media propagates those despite what's actually happening on the ground. We used to call it the Cronkite effect from Vietnam War. We used to call it the CNN effect. I don't know if you want to call it the Twitter or whatever effect, when even if it's not a law, there's so many things that people believe are laws that aren't laws. And if we get to this place where this standard that Israel has becomes not a real law, but not even a customary law, but like a misbelieved law, like the fact that hospitals are untouchable. Hospitals are very protected. And Hamas used every hospital in Gaza as a military purpose.
The military base.
Yeah, for military purposes, on purpose, because it's a highly protected area where you're required by law to announce to the enemy who's using it to stop using it, and then take all precautions to prevent the harm to the wounded, to the medical staff, everything, which Israel did. But that's basically the tiptoeing into actual beliefs where you can convince populations that their own military, which I have run into, where Israel, this is what they've said. Is that right? Are they violating a law of war? No, they're actually going above and beyond all the laws of war. But where you get to the point where, this is where people don't understand. Hamas is not trying to defeat the IDF. Hamas's strategy, which the world has fallen into, is to convince the world that Israel is doing something wrong, and that there is this great misbelief on what Israel is actually doing, and that all the suffering will just stop if Israel stops. No, that the suffering for the Palestinian people will increase and will continue because Hamas says they don't care about their own people.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the goal of all of these terrorists. They don't care about their own people. They have no respect for human lives. The lives of the Gazans or of the Lebanese in the north are simply pawns to be played with in this goal of trying to destroy Israel. And whilst it's understood that these organizations don't have the capability, the military capability, to actually destroy Israel, what they're trying to do in the international arena, and sadly succeeding, is to just delegitimize Israel, to put Israel in the corner as the offender, as the abuser of human rights, as the abuser of the laws of wars, when really the opposite is the truth. That's the projection of their activities and of their behavior. And really, so that takes us up in just the few minutes that we have left, John, to going up to the northern arena. We've seen, as I said in the introduction, really a war of attrition with Lebanon going on now for almost 9 months, and that war is now getting to the point where it's about to boil over. The massive IDF operations in Gaza are coming to a limited end, and now it's time to go north. And suddenly, the U.S. administration is again sending the USS Eisenhower into the Mediterranean Sea, an aircraft carrier. What do you think that means of the U.S. assessment of the potential of really a substantial explosion in the north?
Yeah, it's so, this is the crazy world we live in, where Israel has had to justify its right to defend itself in the international community, in the media, despite all these lies, and despite even the failure to recognize that while people say they don't want another front, the fact that Hezbollah began attacking viciously Israel in an act of war on October 8th and then launched thousands of rockets, drones, mortars, artillery at Israel to where which any other nation would be unacceptable, where 80 to 100,000 citizens are homeless for over 8 months. Any other nation that would be unacceptable. But because Israel has to justify its right to defend itself, this is the point where we're at, where we continue to say, well, we don't want escalation. Nobody wants a second front. And then, okay, put pressure on the other party attacking Israel, and while Israel doesn't respond, to stop doing that. The rotation of the U.S. carrier strike group as the Eisenhower leaves, but the Theodore Roosevelt replaces it. I don't think that's a sign of U.S. policy. I think that I'm actually very proud of the U.S. policy that the United States will defend Israel. But I know that war is politics. I know that if there would have been the United States would have done the war against Hamas and Gaza differently. But Israel, war is the pursuit of political objectives and your allies. So Israel's had to make very hard decisions, and it can be criticized on that, well, you got to do it this way, because if you're not, this is literally the awful decisions Israel's had to make, where what it would need to defend itself against Hezbollah, a much greater threat than Hamas, a terror army, another one of over 100,000 with advanced munitions, over 100,000 rockets and missiles, and the world says, well, figure out a way to make them stop, but don't launch a war, a self-defense war. I think it's very problematic. I think Israel has tried every means to, especially diplomatic, and signaling deterrence, signaling war plans, signaling preparations to defend themselves, trying to convince the other combatant, in this case Hezbollah, who is Iran's cherry of a proxy, since they're all Iranian-backed proxies, as Iran pursues its grand strategy for the Middle East. But this is the dilemma, and we don't even have time to talk about Iran, a state actor, attacking Israel during the midst of all of this with a massive barrage to cause massive harm to civilians of over 300 cruise, ballistic missiles, drones, everything on April 12th. While this is all happening and all the pressures on Israel to do things a certain way and to not escalate things while it's being attacked by so many enemies all at once, that would be unacceptable to any other nation of the world. I do think that the United States will continue to support Israel, but I also know the understanding of the complexity of, well, Israel should just do these things. Well, unfortunately, Israel can't just do those things. It relies on many partners and has many relationships and this has been, if you want to look at the genesis of the cause of the operation, whether it's the Abraham Accords or the normalizing relationships with the Arab nations, like, why are these enemies attacking now? Because in some ways, of course, everybody's fallen into the Hamas strategy of trying to force Israel to not achieve its goals, to not remove Hamas from power, to not bring their hostages home immediately, and to not respond to Hezbollah. But Israel, every nation's primary goal is survival and the protection of its populations, to include not just in the immediate, but in the grander picture. I don't know what's going to happen in the north, but I can tell you, just from logical military analysis, is that the current status cannot continue. And the fact that it's been allowed to continue thus far is very unfortunate for the Israeli people. But it cannot continue that Hezbollah attacks Israel in northern Israel, and that 100,000 Israelis at a massive cost to the Israeli nation are homeless, and actually within them have a fear of not even wanting to return home if it gets better, because deterrence is also about a sense of security within the people themselves.
Yeah, and all this within the wider context of each war that you lose again destroys that deterrence, or and again makes you really volatile to continuing aggression. If we lose with Hamas, then there's no way Hezbollah will ever stop. If we lose to Hezbollah, there's no way that Iran will ever stop. And when you put this into the wider picture of the direct assault of of Iran on Israel as well, and you throw in just that little tidbit of what happens when you have a nuclear Iran, and then looking at this picture and the spectrum of threats, it would seem that it would lose all control if you had Hezbollah with dirty bombs. That would change the entire equation of the type of wars that we've seen, that we've expected, because it's not a state with the responsibility of a state when to use nuclear weapons. This is a genocidal terrorist organization that doesn't care about human lives, and that is being fed by the Iranian regime. Unfortunately, John, as much as I would like to continue on, our time has almost run out. Most of these programs, unfortunately, discuss not a small amount of doom and gloom, and so I like to try and end with a positive note. So one positive note that you can think of going forward as to where do you think that Israel is winning the war, losing the war with God? Let's just focus with Hamas at the moment.
Yeah, I think they're absolutely winning the war, but I can't tell you if they're going to win the war. I think they're achieving the military goals systematically, despite all the constraints. The IDF are doing amazing things that blew my mind when I visited the forces in Gaza on what they've been able to achieve, despite the constraints put on them from the international community. And I understand it's not black and white on the way, but the fact that they figured out a way, right, just like Israel has in its past, to do the unachievable, things that people can't even imagine. The IDF and Israel has found a way, despite the constraints, to not lose against Hamas, to continue to put military pressure, to systematically dismantle its military capabilities in Gaza, things that people thought that would never be possible, and at great cost to Israel and the IDF. And they've figured out a way to do the unimaginable. They need to continue that because they're close to dismantling Hamas's military capability. But I can't tell you where it's going to go because of the complexities of the political situation and the threats to Israel at the moment.
That is indeed. I think part of the really the complexity of what's going on here is that you have a country that's fighting for its life, being subjected to individual, unique, really unprecedented standards in a war where the ingenuity that has been used through the war is something which really is mind-blowing, to be able to move civilian populations en masse from one point to another, to a third point, to ensure that everything that they need on the way is then catered for. At the same time, a massive humanitarian effort, which you know is also supporting and funding and emboldening your own enemies. I think it's a situation which no one really has been in before, and I would really hope that no one will be in that situation again. But yet, that's the situation that Israel and the IDF finds itself in, and that's only with Hamas. When we look further towards Lebanon and towards Hezbollah, I think things are going to be even more complicated, even more lethal for Israel as a country, with the capabilities of Hezbollah, which really we would need to carry out a substantial preemptive strike in order to destroy as much of their capabilities as possible. And that's something which it's not even really a preemptive strike because the war is ongoing, but really a first big strike, which we would have to see coming up soon. So in the meantime, John, thank you again for joining us, and thank you for your insights. It really has been a pleasure to watch and hear your analysis all the way through the war, giving that clear voice of both morality combined with the understanding of warfare, which seems to have been so distorted by so many people along the way. And it's really refreshing to know that there's a voice of sanity out there.
Well, thank you. And one comment that I'll leave you with, since you mentioned it and made me think about it, is that the innovations of Israel and the IDF will save the lives of Americans in the future, from their approach to active protection systems on their vehicles, to how to deal with tunnel warfare, to how to preserve and protect civilians in combat. It will save lives in the future, just like their innovations after the Yom Kippur War, how they did the unthinkable, changed the entire U.S. military, especially the land doctrine. It will save lives in the future. So that's for me, another reason why I do what I do, because I know the amazing things that the IDF are doing will save lives around the world in the future.
I think that the technology that's been used to and has been developed to carry out that subterranean, the tunnel warfare, the wind coats that have been that's the technology that's been put onto the tanks in order to fight off all types of RPGs and smaller weapons. I think those are definitely things that in the future we'll see being employed by other armies. So in the meantime, again, thank you, John. For our audience, thank you for joining us. We will be back again with you on Wednesday at 4 o'clock Israel time. And we hope to see you again then. Until then, keep safe, everyone. And just enjoy the next few days coming up. Thank you. Bye-bye.